Brexit means Brexit.
An exit from Brexit.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Seamus, I'm not sure this is a great idea, is it?
Order!
Hello and welcome to Debated Podcast. This is the second episode with me, Conrad, with Will, my co-host, and
hello.
And this week we are joined by Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, who is a Brexit Party candidate for London for the MEP elections, and is also an educational researcher. So before we get started, would you like to sort of say a bit more about what drove you to support Brexit in the first place, Alka?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. For me, it was two things really, two related things. The most important was I really felt there was a really a problem with democratic accountability in political life and public life. I felt the established parties were really failing to have any kind of connection. They were more and more insulated and isolated from the public that they really are meant to serve. You know, it's through our consent that they rule. So I was very, very concerned about that. And then I suppose a related issue is one of a kind of increasing technocratic approach in public and institutional life more widely, which people have said, well, how is that related to the European Union? What's the connection? I don't think necessarily there's a direct connection, but I do think, if politics is done in a certain way, it does kind of roll out downwards and across horizontally throughout society, and sort of measures of accountability, target setting, outcome. I work in education, so sort of outcome-led strategies that have quite a negative effect on the intellectual content of what's going on in education seemed really problematic to me as well.
Yeah, I resonate a lot with what you just said, because I voted a lot for Brexit based a lot on democratic principles and sort of the distantness of the EU. I mean, my sort of philosophy is that power should be as close to the people as possible. Yeah. And the fact is, the EU is just so distant, and so many layers of bureaucracy and stuff that people don't feel like they have control, and that was my simple reason. And we've got Will who voted Remain. I don't know if he's got anything to say about that.
Well, no, I think it's an interesting point of view, and one that I think by any party that supported Remain or still supports Remain has to address, because I think that it's understandable that people feel that there isn't the same democratic accountability to the people of the United Kingdom from the EU that they might have, say, from a local councillor or from their MP. I just wondered, what sort of arguments do you think you would make when out canvassing to someone who had voted for Remain to convince them in these elections to vote for the Brexit Party?
Well, I think the main thing, which is the most important thing, it's the one Conrad mentioned, which is the democratic deficit, and it's not just that the EU is distant, like physically. It's understanding that institutionally it's so bound up that the people that rule us would rather seek their legitimacy and look for consent, not to their own populations, but to their pals, in other nations. And the group that it isn't like this. It depends who I'm talking to. Quite a few younger people see the EU as a kind of wonderful international cultural club, but it isn't really. It's a club of business people with a very restricted idea of what business is, which is mainly sort of trading and big banks, which has done a lot of harm to the economic bases of nations. And it's really, as well as the kind of more ideological and political problems. So in terms of talking to people on the street, I mean, it's very simple. It's just say, do you think your vote counts? If you think it doesn't count, but you think it should count, and if you think our government should be responsible to us rather than to their pals in Europe, then the Brexit Party is the only party to vote for on Thursday.
Do you think the fact that you haven't had a manifesto going into these elections, do you think that it's helped you or hindered you somewhat campaigning?
Probably a bit of both. Although I think generally the people that really stick to that, are really wedded to that as an objection, are probably people who are very, very staunch Remainers. Because I think it's quite. Well, firstly, I think the parties that have had manifestos haven't done a great job, so I can't see how a manifesto alone is like a talisman for great politics. The second thing is we don't have a manifesto as such because we're as yet not a proper party. It's a supporters party, and we're united on that principle of democracy. And overall, I think that has helped because people can see how important it is when you can have a living embodiment of bankers, nurses, civil servants, teachers, a whole range of people standing, just like you have in real life, who can get together and commit themselves to something that's bigger than each individual.
Yeah, that was one thing that was quite noticeable when the Brexit Party was releasing a list of candidates, that they were such like a diverse range, almost without like quotas or anything, but they were from not even just in like the skin deep level, but also in terms of their backgrounds, their life experiences, which I think was a big contrast when Change UK released their list, and it was just all these failed old politicians and journalists from and there wasn't that range. So you've obviously come from the educational academic side of things. Is it difficult being a Brexit supporter in that kind of environment?
Just a little bit. Yes, I can't tell you that it's not like I've had a pile of abuse or anything like that, but it's very immediately after the referendum, everywhere I think I was still just in the last year of my PhD at Cambridge, and all the meetings, academic meetings I went to, everybody assumed that I was Remain, and I was just very open and upfront and said, well, actually, I voted Leave, and literally I had people kind of look at. One person actually said to me, "Oh gosh, I've never met anyone who voted to Leave," as if I was a sort of species of some strange creature. And he sort of turned away and went off to find somebody else to chat with, which was fine by me. But and then in a crowded hall at the LSE where there's Amartya Sen talking, and it was brilliant, really good speech. But then just at the end, he does that thing which a lot of academics do, which is slip in a political point, and it was about Brexit, and again it was about assuming that everybody that voted Leave was unintelligent. And I had to raise an objection from the audience. And I don't know if you know the main theatre at the LSE. It's a pretty big auditorium. Everybody was just like hissing and rolling their eyes at me. So it's not been comfortable. But I hope the few academics that know me and know my work can kind of get beyond that.
Yeah, because I'm a student who does a course that's biochemistry, so it's not. You wouldn't think that Brexit would ever even come up in lectures, but you do occasionally get the snide comments. Like they'll make a little joke, which obviously, they're fair play to them. They've allowed their views, but it sort of hints at sort of a culture that And I've got friends who do things like history and politics, where like the bias is quite clear and quite prominent in the actual teaching. I mean, you do history, Will. I mean, what have you found it to be like?
Well, I found it interesting that in terms of looking at periods like the 1970s and the 80s, how much there's been an influence from writers from a particularly Marxist perspective, but that hasn't been reflected in a similar sort of balance with perhaps more right-wing thinkers of the time. I think it's interesting how that can sometimes warp a particular perspective of history in a particular era. Because if you're reading an account of something written by someone with a particularly overt political opinion, whether that be left or right, and you just believe it as gospel, that can then overly influence how you respond to questions. So I think it's interesting that, as you said, Conrad, that there are such biases that sometimes creep in regardless of subject.
Can I step in here?
Oh, yeah, sure.
No, of course you can.
I think that is really true, and it's very. I think the social sciences and the humanities and arts are particularly prone to it, because it's those subjects that the question of interpretation has a much bigger role. You know, the methods of working in those disciplines are quite different to those of the natural sciences or of mathematics. And what's been really worrying for me, my area is English, is the kind of what you were alluding to, Conrad, I think, when you were saying that there's sort of one kind of Marxist or deconstructive or post-structuralist, whatever you want to call it, approach that dominates. And it's really, really worrying, because it's not just, that doesn't just, I mean, the political bias is usually quite clear to see, but it actually, it hampers the progress of the discipline itself. It kind of really distorts the truth value and the truth content of knowledge within that discipline. And I think that for me is a deeply, deeply worrying thing, because if you're not going to have academics committed to pursuing, truthful knowledge within academia, then that's a really big problem.
I wondered, you were talking about abuse. I wondered whether, because as we've seen in the news today, Nigel Farage's the milkshake was thrown over him. I wondered whether you had faced any such sort of similar abuse when out campaigning, and if you had, whether you ever felt threatened, or did it antagonise you in any way, or what? How did you feel about it?
Okay, well, it's funny you should ask that, because I was out canvassing yesterday in Romford, and I had just had a brilliant range of responses. From somebody saying you're a disgusting racist to me, right in my face, which was a little odd, because I'm actually from my ethnic origin is Indian. And then I had, somebody else could sort of go by and say, no way, I'm not voting for you. I want all immigrants to be chucked out. So it's sort of two very extreme responses. I didn't feel threatened by either of them. But I didn't particularly. I thought, okay, that's what you think. Neither of them were like threatening to me. They just wanted to say their piece and walk off. But in between, I just spoke to so many people of such a range of nuanced opinions that it was really, really refreshing. So occasionally you get, I feel more at threat, if you like, in a weird way, not physically, but I feel more nervous, not on the streets talking to ordinary people, but much more in academic situations, because the kind of quiet, passive, aggressive hostility that arises in those things. There's a very an element of I think assumed superiority that isn't always warranted, that can have quite a chilling and unnerving effect. For me, that's worse than the blatant insults.
Yeah, I mean, I've done plenty of campaigning in the past as a Conservative Party member, and you do get obviously some abuse, you can call it that, from on the doorstep. That's just, but I think that is something that's going to happen no matter what party you do it for. And but I feel like people can have a bit of a shout and have their say or whatever. When it comes to things being thrown and that, you're stepping into a level that we shouldn't really be crossing in like a democratic society. There's a lot of people have wondered how the Brexit Party is going to continue after these elections, because obviously these elections you've got the the thing of democracy holding everyone together. But you've
Yeah.
got the broad range of candidates, which is great for these elections. But you know, how can someone like Claire Fox and Anne Widdecombe continue in the same party afterwards? What would you say would be the kind of policies that could sort of bring them together?
Well, I think what we talk. I mean, you're quite right. That may well be. That's. I think we all recognise that the really difficult, hard work is going to come after the 23rd. I think all I can say is that it remains to be seen exactly how the party will work internally. But there's certainly so far the kinds of policies around. Well, I mean, to do with the economy or fisheries or immigration. Those are the kind of key. Education, of course. What I am going to be arguing for is that we need to have the fullest discussion within the party and within as broader range of supporters as possible. And then there will have to be sort of groups set up, advisors, because obviously we don't all know everything about everything. I'm working alongside people who would be really good on economic policy, for example, but who don't know anything about education. I know nothing about fracking, so when it comes to the environment, I would want to be having conversations with people who had more expert knowledge in that. So I can't say as yet. It has to be worked out, to be honest. It has to be worked out. But what I can say is that there's an openness to trying things out, there's a real commitment to trying to do politics, to do a different politics, achieve a different politics. And that's going to mean having a wider range of conversations, non-technocratic conversations as well, not just sort of quite passive ones, So they may well be falling out, who knows? I think we'll have to wait and see. Sorry if that sounds like I'm sitting on the fence, but that really is all I know.
I mean, it's kind of understandable at this stage because it's. I mean, how
We've been going
the Brexit
4
vote hasn't been
weeks.
going that long, has it?
No, 4
So
weeks.
it's in that way sort of incredible how it's increased in the polls by so much. What would you dare to make predictions in how well you think the party will do during the European elections? Or will you just wait for the polls
We'll
to
wait
actually close?
and see. I mean, obviously, we're hopeful. There are lots of good signs. I've certainly I don't just go by polls. I think lots of people have been caught on that one before. But I go more on, the actual membership and as you pointed out, the kind of speed with which people have been signing up. And also the way people have been just speaking to me. Like I was in a library, and the librarian kind of quietly said to me, "Have I seen you on YouTube?" And she was referring to my launch speech, and she was just sort of thanking me for standing, and it really kind of took me aback and made me feel quite sort of humble and aware, really super aware of the responsibility of doing something like this. And I think it's, we'll have to wait and see, but it clearly has tapped into and allowed the voice, people who have been silent and felt they've had to remain silent for such a long time, to come out and make themselves heard in the public arena, which can only be a good thing.
I would just quickly like to look at some of the things that you've written, because you've written quite a lot for a variety of different websites, whether that be spiked or education-based websites.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, you wrote an article recently regarding the No Outsiders programme in Parkfield. Yeah. And I just wondered whether you could clarify something for me, because in the piece you argue that it's not a bad thing that the parents should feel that they can take their children out of the school because it teaches something that they disagree with. But you also wrote an article back in 2018 arguing that the banning of the hijab was a liberal act. I was wondering, could you explain how it's liberal to perhaps enforce one thing, such as the banning of the hijab, but it was all right for parents to take their children out of schools like Parkfield. I wondered if you could just elaborate on that a bit.
Sure. I'll do my best. Okay, so it comes. I mean, first of all, I didn't think it was particularly a good thing for parents to take their kids out. I think it's quite sad if it gets to that state where parents feel they have to, because obviously it shows that there's been a sort of breakdown of trust between parents and schools. The key thing for me is that I'm thinking that with liberal cultural values, I don't think you can kind of have like a template or sort of set of things that you apply kind of in quite an automatic way to all situations. So with the hijab, I'll just rewind. The other really important thing is what schools can and can't teach, and the different kinds of the different things schools have to deal with in a pluralistic democratic society. So on the hijabs, I agree schools have the right to set their own uniform code, and if they decide that they want to not have the hijab for their own reasons, the school at that time that particular school was concerned to inculcate a feeling of inclusiveness amongst all their pupils, then I felt the schools have every right to do that. So that was why I stood up for the schools right there, because that they are, that I think is legitimately within a school's remit. On the much more difficult, tricky thing of teaching sex and relationships education, there are two main points I'd make about that. I mean, I fought against Clause 28 way back when, because I didn't think I thought teachers needed to have the autonomy and freedom to be able to talk to children about these things and, deal with any concerns or anxieties. My worry, and it was actually for the same reason partly for the same reason that I was I think the imposition of SRE is problematic, because in a way it's sort of making teachers feel that they have to talk about these things and talk about them in a certain way, and it can create actually sort of be very counterproductive, because I think teachers need to be able to feel confident to deal with individual situations. And I think both Clause 28 and the imposition of, an official from high code of how to deal with very personal, private matters that actually traditionally, and I think, quite rightly, has been left to the remit of parents, how you personal morality and how you conduct relationships. It's not formal teaching, it's not formal knowledge. You can't kind of get a list of rules, generalizable rules. It's much more, if you like, phronesis or practical wisdom that is much wider than just school or teachers alone. Does that clear it a bit? Or?
Oh, yeah, no, that clears it a bit. I was just wondering, do you not worry, though, that in particular households where there may be parents who don't feel comfortable talking about these issues, that if there isn't a framework in schools to discuss them, a sort of like a compulsory framework, that these kids then might not learn about something that, might be part of their sexuality going forward, or might not, but they might have perhaps not a full understanding of it. Does that not worry you at all?
No, it doesn't. Not really, because I think it's true. Not all parents are the same. Some parents will have different views, and in the particular Parkfield case, I don't agree with the parents' views. They were at the original case. I don't know who got involved later. Various groups and things might have been brought into the fray, but the original parents were not homophobic, or else they would have taken their children out of that school, or protested earlier. It was the head was well known to be a well-known gay deputy head, rather. Sorry, he's not the head. So I don't think it was that. It was their religious beliefs, which, as it happens, I disagree with. But again, it goes. We live in a pluralistic society, so schools have to tread teachers have to tread that line between public knowledge that is accepted as public knowledge, and then sort of exemplifying through their relationships and ethos all kinds of other, if you like, non-stipulable values of how you treat people, how you conduct kinds of conversations and relationships. And then they also have to recognise that, in that pluralistic society, there has to be a kind of you're dealing with parents and families who will have very different ideas to yourself about sexuality and family life, and as long as no one's acting in a prejudiced or violent way, I don't think within the school itself, all kind of acts of the way children act that might harm each other, I think could come under bullying. I don't see why you have to separate out categories of types of offence and harm, because I think, if anything, that works against creating the kind of solidarity that kids kind of build up themselves if you let them do it spontaneously and with a bit of guidance from teachers as they act as professional individuals, I think. In other words, what I'm saying is I think the codification of it, like saying, and it was, it is quite, it is quite, you teach, I'm all for teaching sex in terms of knowledge, as perhaps within biology, the different kinds of sex, and you can expand that if you want to. But the actual relations, I mean, I don't, how can you teach how to have a relationship with somebody? I just, I think what happens is you end up kind of imposing that there's a correct way of doing things that can increase the anxiety of people who are already quite, an anxious age anyway, with the teenagers.
So, moving on to something in higher education that you've spoken on in the past, and that is becoming more and more of a sort of hot topic. I sit on the education exec of the Students' Union at my university, and one topic that we've discussed quite a bit is decolonising the curriculum.
Right.
I was wondering, this is something you've discussed before, but what are your views on this and the step towards that?
Okay, well, it's something I've written about and I'm continually thinking about, actually. So I think there's two things. There's an epistemological and knowledge part to it, and then there's the wider political part to it, to decolonising. I think in as far as calls to decolonise the curriculum are limited to and restrained to expanding the canon and looking for a broader range of texts and revising criteria, but revising criteria on grounds that make sense within the discipline, then that's fine. I'd certainly be all for that. In literature, I think it would be really very productive to have a look at a range of books from, much internationally, African literature, Indian literature, for sure. But that's not really what that isn't really what decolonising demands are about. Really, they're much more a much kind of broader remit of trying to really do politics through the curriculum. And in a way, and I think it is actually a very elitist project because, well, if you're talking about doing politics through education anyway, education doesn't, you're talking about adults and children or adults and young people. It's not equal adults as citizens in the wider political sphere. It's already a kind of selected audience and sphere you're talking about. And you don't, it's a way of co-opting what was a progressive politics decades ago of upholding minority rights in order to help people who face discrimination enter majority society on an equal footing. But I think that's long since gone. What's happening today, and I think decolonising is part of this, is a push by the new elites to use minority arguments against the majority. So in Cambridge, when I hear certain academics, I won't say their names, but, they're very much attached to calls to decolonize the curriculum. And they're complaining about, they say things like, well, you look around and you just see all white faces, all the professors are white. And they automatically assume that that's because of discrimination. But, you just think, well, yeah. Well, if you're on those grounds, if you went to Delhi University, you'd see most of the professors' faces were brown. It just seems like a ludicrous thing to say. And then there's a question of, well, it takes a long time to become a professor unless you want to make professorship just, really kind of devalue what it means and the kind of work time and effort it takes to achieve that status. Then it takes time. So, you've got new cohorts of academics entering academia, and they'll have to work their way up to become professors. I don't think you can shortcut that really without totally saying that education is nothing and politics is politicizing it for a minority interest, which I think is really undemocratic.
No, I think I agree with you a lot on what you said there, and I feel like especially I agree that in terms of broadening and getting more different things involved, that's not a bad thing. But when it's at the expense of what's already being taught, I think it's a bit worrying, and especially when they try and, because I ran for education officer in my students' union, wasn't successful, but one of the questions that I was asked about that, and I mentioned that I do biochemistry, so as a science student, I don't know as much about decolonising as someone, because it doesn't seem as relevant to my subject.
Yeah, and I bet that went down well.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. It didn't go down well, but I just don't understand where you can come from in that sense, because when I'm doing my project on genome sizes, what doesn't really, I'm not really looking at what the name of the professor is. I'm just looking at what the science is. But anyway, so
you'll be surprised. I was at a conference where the paper was being given on decolonizing the Himalayan rivers, which I talked to people in India about that. They just fell about laughing. They couldn't understand what on earth was going on. But on a more serious note, it's really worrying, because you can see that organisations like the student unions, in line with things like the Equality Challenge Unit, which are new bodies, they're really, it is like, they're narrowing their kind of cultural gatekeepers, and it's really a kind of form of what do you call it, turf, stomping out your turf, of trying to claim authority, but the authority isn't based on creating any better knowledge. It's just created on moralising and kind of quite imposing a moralistic conformity, which is totally antithetical to any intellectual inquiry, really. Deeply worrying.
So it's been great having you on in this episode. It's been really interesting discussion. But before we go, there's been another undemocratic, bureaucratic EU institution that's been in the news recently, and that is the Eurovision Song Contest, which happened at the weekend. So do you think that we should be leaving that as well as the EU?
Well, I missed it this year. I'm afraid I'm going to have to say I really haven't got much of an opinion on the Eurovision Song Contest. No. I think I gave up watching it when what's his name won it. I've forgotten his name now. A couple of years ago, he's always on Celebrity Mead telly and that now. But no, I'm afraid I'm going to have to just say I don't know on that one. But thank you very much for inviting me.